The cabin went silent, the instant the seatbelt sign chimed on. Not because the plane was ready to move, but because a woman's voice cut through the first-class aisle like a blade. "You need to get out of that seat, right now." Every head turned. The boy in seat 1A did not flinch. He was young, barely 19. Black hoodie pulled low backpack tucked neatly between his shoes. His hands rested on his knees, steady. Too steady for someone being spoken to like that. His eyes lifted slowly, calm but alert, like a pilot checking instruments in rough air. "I'm sorry," he said, voice even. "That's my seat." Margaret Whitmore stood over him. Lips tight, posture, rigid pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. 68 years old, the kind of woman who had never raised her voice because she never needed to. Authority had always arrived before she did. "No," she replied, not loudly, not angrily. "Worse. Certain. It isn't." A low murmur rippled through the cabin. The soft hiss of overhead vents. The click of a phone screen, lighting up 2 rows back. Somewhere near the galley, a flight attendant froze mid-step. The boy glanced down at the boarding pass, still folded in his hand. He unfolded it carefully, as if the paper itself deserved respect. Then he looked back up. 1A, he said. Window. Margaret didn't look at the pass. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on his face, measuring, sorting, filing him into a category she had learned long ago. "Sweetheart," she said, lowering her voice, leaning in just enough for him to smell her perfume, clean and expensive. These seats are usually assigned to corporate travelers, executives, people with obligations. The word hung there. Obligations. Heavy. Loaded. The boy felt it. Everyone did. Across the aisle, a man in his early 70s shifted uncomfortably, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. His jaw tightened. He had lived long enough to recognize that tone. It was the same one his father used to hear at banks in the 1970s. Polite. Final. Dismissive. The boy inhaled slowly, the sound of it barely audible but deliberate. He had learned that trick early. Control your breathing. Control the moment. "I paid for this seat," he said. "I checked in on time. I didn't upgrade. I didn't ask for anything extra." Margaret straightened. The corners of her mouth lifted in something that resembled a smile, but never reached her eyes. "That may be what you think," she replied. "But there's been a mistake, and the easiest way to fix it is for you to move." Behind her, the aisle was blocked. A young flight attendant stood there, frozen eyes darting between the two. Her name tag read Emily. She was maybe 24. New uniform, new smile, new fear. "Ma'am," Emily said, gently stepping forward. "If I could just see both boarding passes, we can clear this up." Margaret didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge the request. Her focus never left the boy. "We don't need to make a scene," Margaret said. "There are other seats. Perfectly fine seats. Let's be reasonable." Reasonable. The boy felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger. Something sharper. Something quieter. "I am being reasonable," he said. "I'm staying where I belong." That word again. Belong. Emily swallowed. She reached out, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. The cabin clock ticked forward. Boarding doors still open. Ground crew waiting. Schedules stacking up like dominoes. Emily glanced toward the front galley, where the purser stood pretending not to watch. He was in his late 40s. Veteran. Knew exactly what was happening. Also knew how expensive a delay could be. So Emily said, lowering her voice now, bending slightly toward the boy. "Would you be open to another seat in first class, just temporarily? We'll make sure you're taken care of." Margaret exhaled, satisfied. Not a victory yet, but close. The boy looked at Emily. Really looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twisted together. He saw fear, not malice. Pressure, not cruelty. Then he looked past her, down the aisle at the faces watching him. Some curious, some irritated, some quietly ashamed. He shook his head once. No. The word landed softly and hit hard. Emily's eyes widened. The purser shifted his weight. Somewhere in the back, a man muttered, "Jesus Christ." Margaret's smile vanished. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dropping, losing its softness. "You're delaying an international flight. Do you understand how serious that is?" "Yes," the boy replied. "Then move." "No." The tension snapped tight, like a cable under strain. Margaret straightened fully now, her expression cooling into something practiced and dangerous. She turned finally to Emily. "Get the captain," she said. "This is unacceptable." Emily hesitated. Just for a second, then nodded and hurried toward the cockpit, her footsteps quick, almost apologetic. As she disappeared, the boy leaned back slightly in his seat. The leather creaked under his weight. He placed the boarding pass on the armrest, flat, visible, undeniable. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Once, twice, he ignored it. Across the aisle, the older man finally spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind that carried authority earned over decades. "The kid's right," he said. "Seat 1A is Seat 1A. Margaret didn't look at him. She didn't need allies. She believed in systems, and systems had always favored her. The cockpit door opened with a muted click. Captain Daniel Harper stepped out, tall, composed, silver at the temples. 55 years old, 30 years in the air. He took in the scene in one sweep. The standing woman, the seated boy, the watching cabin. "What's going on?" he asked. Margaret turned instantly, her posture softening. Her voice shifting into something wounded, offended. "Captain," she said, "I'm being forced into an uncomfortable situation. This young man is refusing to cooperate, and we're going to miss our departure window." Captain Harper looked at the boy. "Sir." The boy met his gaze. Didn't rush, didn't fidget. "My boarding pass says 1A, he said. "I'm sitting in 1A. The captain nodded once. "Simple. Efficient. Let me see both passes." Margaret handed hers over immediately. Crisp. Confident. The boy did the same. Captain Harper studied them, his brow furrowed, then smoothed. A pause. A long one. Margaret shifted impatient now. Well, Captain Harper looked up. "Ma'am," he said, Your seat is 1B. The cabin exhaled. Margaret stared at him. Truly stared, as if the words hadn't registered. "That can't be right," she said. "I always sit by the window." Captain Harper held her gaze. "Not on this flight." Silence. Thick. Charged. For a brief moment, something flickered across Margaret's face. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something darker. She leaned closer to the captain and spoke quietly. Too quietly. "I expect better judgment from this airline." The boy watched her. Watched the way her hand trembled just slightly at her side. Watched the mask crack. Captain Harper straightened. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm now, "please move to your assigned seat." Margaret turned, slowly. As she passed the boy, she paused. Just long enough. "This isn't over," she murmured. "People will hear about this." The boy didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead out the window at the blinking lights of the runway, stretching into the dark. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Yes," he said quietly. On the other end of the line, a man's voice came through, calm, controlled, urgent. "We have a problem," the voice said. The system flagged a procedural breach in first class. The boy closed his eyes for a brief second. "I know," he replied. And somewhere below the cabin floor, a decision was already being made that would stop this plane from ever leaving the ground. The jet bridge shuddered as the ground crew pulled away. Then stopped abruptly. Metal groaning against metal, a sound no one expected to hear again once boarding had finished. Captain Harper was still standing in the aisle when the chime sounded twice sharp and unmistakable. His eyes flicked to the ceiling panel, then to the cockpit door behind him. That signal did not come lightly. "Emily," he said quietly without turning. "Hold here." The young flight attendant froze, hands clasped in front of her, breath shallow. Margaret Whitmore had just reached seat 1B when the plane seemed to exhale and then seize. The subtle vibration beneath the floor vanished. The low hum of systems shifted pitch. Experienced travelers felt it immediately. Something had changed. "What's happening now?" Margaret asked, her voice tight irritation sharpening into alarm. Captain Harper didn't answer her. He was already moving long strides back toward the cockpit. The murmurs started, then rippling backward like wind through tall grass. People checked their watches. A man in row 3 muttered about connections in Frankfurt. A woman clutched her purse closer. The boy remained still. He sat with his shoulders relaxed, gaze steady on the dark glass of the window. The reflection looking back at him did not look 19. It looked older, tired, focused. Like someone used to watching systems fail before people noticed. His phone vibrated again. This time he lifted it just enough to see the name on the screen. Caleb Rourke. He answered without a word. "They pulled the manual override," Caleb said. His voice was calm, but underneath it ran a current of restrained urgency. Ground ops flagged an inconsistency between cabin protocol and safety compliance. The boy closed his eyes briefly. "Which one?" "All of them," Caleb replied. "The delay request came through operations less than 30 seconds after you answered me. That's not coincidence." The boy lowered the phone slightly, glancing toward to the cockpit door. He could see shadows moving behind it now. Quick. Purposeful. Who authorized it? He asked. Caleb paused, just a fraction too long. Not the captain, he said. Not the airline either. The boy's jaw tightened. That's not how this works, he said. No. Caleb agreed. It's how it breaks. In first class, Margaret had turned in her seat, now craning her neck toward the aisle. She watched as Emily whispered urgently with the purser, their faces pale, their words clipped. I have a meeting in London in the morning, Margaret said loudly, ensuring the surrounding passengers could hear her. This delay is unacceptable. The man across the aisle from her, the one with the cufflinks, didn't respond. He was watching the boy now, watching the way his posture hadn't changed, the way his hands remained open, resting lightly on his knees. No fidgeting, no frustration. Just waiting. Emily stepped forward, forcing her voice into a practiced calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief operational pause. Please remain seated. A pause. Not a delay. Not a problem. The words were chosen carefully. Operational pause. Margaret scoffed. What does that even mean? Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Harper emerged, his face, unreadable eyes sharper than before. He walked directly to the purser, spoke quietly, quickly. The purser's expression shifted from concern to something closer to fear. Then Harper turned and faced the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice steady, carrying easily. This aircraft will remain at the gate for the moment. Please stay seated. We'll update you shortly. A chorus of protests rose instantly. Frustration, confusion, a ripple of anger moving fast. Margaret stood halfway from her seat. Captain, this is ridiculous. We were cleared for departure. Captain Harper met her gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This decision didn't come from me, he said. The cabin quieted. That alone was unsettling. Margaret blinked. Then who made it? Captain Harper didn't answer immediately. He glanced almost imperceptibly toward Seat 1A. Margaret followed his eyes. For the first time since boarding, she really looked at the boy. Not the hoodie, not the backpack. His face, his eyes, the absence of anxiety, the quiet certainty. You, she said slowly, disbelief creeping in. You did this. The boy didn't look at her. He was listening to Caleb. They've initiated a Level 3 compliance hold, Caleb said. That's not public-facing. Someone upstairs wants answers before this bird leaves the ground. The boy's thumb hovered over the screen. How long, he asked. Indefinite, Caleb replied. Until they're satisfied. The boy exhaled, controlled, deliberate. Then they won't be, he said. He ended the call and stood. The movement was subtle, but immediate. Heads turned, spines straightened. Conversations died mid-sentence. The aisle suddenly felt narrower, charged. He didn't rush. He stepped into the aisle and faced Captain Harper. Captain, he said, voice low, respectful. May I speak with you privately? Captain Harper studied him for a long second. 30 years of experience told him this was no teenager trying to flex. This was someone who understood leverage, Cockpit Harper said. Margaret stepped forward instinctively. Absolutely not. This is absurd. He's delaying this entire flight. Captain Harper raised a hand. Just one. Ma'am, he said firm now. Please sit down. The authority in his voice left no room for debate. Margaret hesitated, then sank back into her seat, her breath-shallow eyes darting. As the boy walked past her, she caught his sleeve. You don't belong here, she hissed. Whatever you think you are, this isn't your world. He stopped, turned. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't smug. It was something far colder. Clear. This plane, he said quietly, is very much my world. He followed Captain Harper into the cockpit. The door closed behind them with a final heavy click. Inside, the atmosphere was different. No passengers, no performances, just systems, screens, data flowing in controlled chaos. The first officer stood back, arms crossed, eyes wide. Harper gestured for the boy to sit, then stopped himself. You're not a passenger, are you? Harper said. The boy shook his head once. No, sir. What are you? The boy reached into his backpack and removed a slim tablet. No logos. No branding. He powered it on and turned the screen toward Harper. Rows of data bloomed instantly. Live feeds, atmospheric modeling, predictive vectors overlaid in precise geometry. The heartbeat of the aircraft rendered in color and motion. Harper felt his throat tighten. This system, the boy said, has been running in shadow mode on your fleet for 6 months. Tonight was supposed to be its final verification pass. Harper stared at the screen. Recognition flickered. Atlas, he said. The boy nodded. My name is Elijah Brooks, he said. And if this flight takes off without resolving the procedural breach in your cabin, your airline will fail the certification audit scheduled in 48 hours. Silence. The kind that presses inward. Harper swallowed. You're saying a seating dispute exposed a systemic flaw? Elijah finished. Not in hardware, in judgment, in protocol under pressure. Harper leaned back slowly. He thought of the purser, of Emily, of the choice made to quiet the situation instead of correct it. And the hold, Harper asked. Elijah met his gaze. That was the system protecting itself. Outside the cockpit, Margaret Whitmore sat rigid, heart pounding. Around her, passengers whispered theories, mechanical issues, security threats. Weather. No one suspected the truth, that the fate of this flight now rested on the shoulders of a boy they had already dismissed, and that before this night was over, the ground beneath this aircraft would feel far less stable than the sky above it. The announcement came without warning, stripped of comfort, stripped of apology. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harper speaking. Due to a compliance verification in the forward cabin, this aircraft is temporarily grounded. Please remain seated. The word grounded landed hard, heavier than delay, heavier than maintenance. It meant authority had shifted. It meant someone above schedules and connections had taken control. A wave of sound moved through the cabin. Not shouting. Worse. Low disbelief. nervous laughter that died too quickly. Fingers tapping armrests, the rustle of jackets, the metallic clink of a watch hitting the floor as someone's hand trembled. Margaret Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face. Grounded flights were not normal. Not on international routes. Not at this stage. Not without police or fire crews or flashing lights. This wasn't weather. This wasn't mechanical. This was intentional. She sat rigid, spine straight, chin lifted, but her hands had curled into tight fists in her lap. Her pulse thudded in her ears loud enough to drown out the murmurs around her. She replayed the last 10 minutes in her head, searching for the moment things had tipped from inconvenience into danger. Across the aisle, the older man with the cufflinks leaned back slowly. Eyes narrowed now, thoughtful. He wasn't annoyed anymore. He was curious. Curious was worse. In row 2, a couple in their early 60s whispered urgently. A man behind them muttered about missing a granddaughter's birthday. A woman near the window began texting furiously, thumbs shaking. At the front, Emily stood, frozen, her face, pale eyes glassy. She felt the weight of every stare like a physical force. Grounded meant reports. Reports meant names. Names meant careers. She hadn't meant to do anything wrong. She had followed instinct. The instinct to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to avoid escalation. But escalation had arrived anyway. The purser approached, her voice low, urgent. Operations is on the line. They want statements. Now. Emily nodded, throat tight. She glanced once toward the cockpit door, then toward seat 1A. Empty. The boy was still inside. Margaret's gaze snapped forward. She stared at the closed cockpit door as if it were an enemy. Her breath came faster now, shallow, controlled with effort. Something about the way the captain had looked at that boy before disappearing had unsettled her. Not deference. Recognition. She shifted in her seat, smoothing her jacket, rehearsing words in her head. She had spent a lifetime navigating rooms where power shifted without warning. Boardrooms, charity galas, courtrooms where silence mattered more than speech. But this felt different. This felt like being judged by a system that did not care who she knew. Inside the cockpit, the air was tense, humming with data and suppressed urgency. Captain Harper stood with his arms folded, eyes fixed on the tablet Elijah had placed on the console between them. Lines and numbers pulsed softly, updating in real time. Atmospheric vectors adjusted by the second, a silent storm unfolding across invisible layers of sky. The first officer hovered near his seat, uncertain, silent. You're telling me, Harper said carefully, that my crew followed procedure and still failed. Elijah shook his head. They followed habit. Harper's jaw tightened. There's a difference. There's a gap, Elijah replied. And tonight, that gap showed itself. He tapped the screen once. A replay loaded. Not video. Decision flow. Timelines. Micro-delays mapped against human responses. A branching tree of choices that had collapsed inward at one point. The moment the purser chose de-escalation over enforcement, Elijah said the system flagged a divergence. Minor, but measurable. Harper stared. Over a seat. Over authority, Elijah corrected. over who the rules apply to when pressure enters the equation. Harper exhaled slowly. He thought of Emily, of the look on her face, thought of how many times he had seen that same choice made in different uniforms, different decades. Keep things moving, avoid confrontation, let the louder voice win. And if we'd taken off? Harper asked. Elijah didn't hesitate. The audit would have caught it. Not tonight. But soon. And once flagged, your certification for international expansion would be frozen pending review. Harper closed his eyes briefly. And the grounding, Harper said. That was automatic. Elijah nodded. The system is designed to halt when procedural integrity drops below threshold. Tonight crossed it. Harper looked at him, then really looked. Not a boy, not a prodigy headline, someone who had built something with teeth. You realize what this means for everyone out there, Harper said quietly. Elijah's expression softened just slightly. Yes, sir. You're holding 400 people hostage to make a point. Elijah met his gaze, steady. No. I'm preventing 400 people from flying under a system that just proved it will bend for comfort. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Harper straightened. What do you need? Elijah glanced at the cockpit clock. Time mattered now. Not in minutes, in moments. I need accountability, he said, not punishment. Correction. Harper nodded once. You'll have it. Outside, the cabin had shifted from confusion to unease. A uniformed ground operations manager boarded quietly, flanked by 2 airport security officers. No sirens, no raised voices, just presence, the kind that changed the air. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. The manager spoke briefly with the purser, then scanned the cabin. His eyes landed on her. Just for a second. Long enough. She felt suddenly exposed, as if every whispered word, every sideways glance had been recorded. The officers moved forward. Ma'am, one said calmly, stopping beside her seat. We need to speak with you. Margaret looked up at him incredulous. About what exactly? About a reported compliance issue, he replied. Please come with us. A ripple of sound passed through first class. Eyes widened. Someone inhaled sharply. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She forced a smile that did not hold. This is absurd, she said. I've done nothing wrong. The officer remained polite, unmoved. Please. She rose slowly, legs unsteady. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the weight of every gaze, judgment, curiosity, something like satisfaction. As she was guided toward the front, she caught sight of Emily. The young attendant's eyes were wet, apologetic. Margaret looked away. The cockpit door opened again. Elijah stepped out. The cabin stilled. He walked down the aisle, not toward his seat, but toward the officers. Toward Margaret. She froze when she saw him. He stopped a few feet away. Not close, not confrontational, just present. This isn't personal, he said quietly, his voice carrying farther than expected. But it is necessary. Margaret's lips trembled. You're doing this because I questioned you. Elijah shook his head once. I'm doing this because the rules were questioned. The officer gently guided her forward again. As Margaret was escorted off the plane, her composure finally cracked. Tears welled, spilling over, streaking down carefully maintained makeup. The image of control she had carried her whole life dissolved in seconds. The cabin watched in stunned silence as the door closed behind her. The jet bridge disconnected. A long, heavy pause followed. Then Captain Harper's voice came over the intercom, again, steadier now, resolute. "Thank you for your patience. We are addressing the issue. This aircraft will depart once the review is complete." The murmurs resumed, but they were different now, quieter, reflective. Elijah returned to seat 1A. Sat. Buckled in. The older man across the aisle leaned toward him slightly. "You didn't raise your voice," he said. Elijah looked at him. "I didn't need to." The man nodded slowly. "My father would have liked you." Elijah allowed himself a small breath. Outside, the plane reports were already being filed, names logged, decisions documented. And somewhere far above, the cabin beyond, schedules and status, a larger system had taken note. This flight would leave the ground, but nothing else would remain the same. The engines did not start right away. That alone unsettled the cabin more than any announcement could have. Minutes passed. Not the polite, forgettable minutes of boarding delays, but heavy ones. The kind that stretch, the kind that make people aware of their own breathing. The overhead lights remained steady. Too steady, casting everything in a clinical glow that left nowhere to hide. Captain Harper stood in the cockpit doorway, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the cabin with a practiced calm that masked the weight pressing on his chest. He had flown through storms that bent metal and rattled bones. But this was different. This was a storm of decisions, of consequences. Operations had escalated the review, not just to airline headquarters, but to federal oversight. Emily sat on the jump seat near the galley, staring at the floor. Her ears rang with the memory of her own voice the moment she had asked the boy to move. The phrasing replayed over and over. To keep the peace. To avoid disruption. She had thought she was helping. Now she understood she had been choosing comfort over correctness. It felt worse than fear. It felt like shame. The purser leaned toward her, voice barely audible. "They want individual statements. Written, verbal. Timeline accuracy matters." Emily nodded without looking up. Her fingers shook as she folded and unfolded a napkin in her lap. She thought of her father, retired Air Force, who had taught her that procedure existed for a reason, that shortcuts were where accidents were born. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now. In seat 1A, Elijah sat motionless, eyes closed, listening not to the cabin, but to the data streaming silently through the tablet on his tray table. The Atlas system continued to map the airspace above the Atlantic, indifferent to human discomfort, focused only on probability and margin. The irony did not escape him. The system was calm because it was designed to be. People were not. His phone buzzed once, then again. He opened the message. "Caleb, FAA compliance wants direct clarification. They're asking if you'll testify to intent or structural failure." Elijah stared at the words. Intent was a dangerous thing. Assigning it meant assigning blame. Structural failure meant systems, Training. Culture. He typed back slowly. Structural. Always structural. Across the aisle, the older man watched him with quiet fascination. He had lived long enough to know the difference between arrogance and restraint. The boy carried none of the first and all of the second. That unsettled him more than confidence ever could. "You okay there, son?" the man asked softly. Elijah opened his eyes, met his gaze. "Yes, sir." The man nodded, then after a moment added, "You remind me of someone I flew with years ago. Didn't talk much. But when he did, people listened." Elijah allowed a faint, polite smile. It was gone as quickly as it came. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door closed again. Captain Harper returned to his seat, headset on, now speaking in low tones to a voice only he could hear. His first officer watched him closely, reading tension in the way his jaw set, the way his fingers drummed once, then stopped. "What are they saying?" the first officer asked quietly. Harper didn't answer immediately. He finished the transmission, then removed the headset. "They're not asking us to justify the grounding," he said. "They're asking why it didn't happen sooner." The first officer's eyebrows lifted. "That's not good." "No," Harper agreed. "But it's honest." In the cabin, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harper said, voice steady but stripped of its earlier formality. "Thank you for your continued patience. We are finalizing a compliance review required by federal oversight. This is not a safety emergency, but it is a safety priority. We appreciate your cooperation." Safety priority. The phrase landed differently now. It wasn't soothing. It was sobering. A man in row 4 sighed heavily. A woman 2 rows back wiped at her eyes. Phones buzzed again as messages were sent, and resent explanations typed and retyped. No one stood up. No one argued. They had all felt the shift. Emily rose from her seat, when summoned legs, stiff heart pounding. She walked toward the forward galley where 2 men in dark jackets waited, badges clipped discreetly at their waists. They spoke kindly. That made it worse. "Just tell us exactly what happened," one said. "From your perspective?" Emily swallowed and began. She spoke of the request, of the pressure, of the choice to ask instead of enforce. Her voice cracked once, then steadied. She did not excuse herself. She did not blame Margaret. She owned the moment. When she finished, one of the men nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "That matters." Emily returned to her seat, feeling hollow, lighter, heavier. Elijah watched the process unfold with the same quiet intensity he brought to debugging code at 3 in the morning. Systems revealed themselves under stress. People did too. His phone buzzed again. "Caleb." "They're asking if Atlas initiated the hold autonomously." Elijah typed back. "Yes, as designed." "Caleb." "That's going to raise questions." Elijah stared at the blinking cursor before responding. "Good." In the cockpit, Harper received the final call. "Captain Harper," the voice said. "Based on preliminary review, the hold will be lifted. However, a full report is required within 48 hours. Crew retraining protocols will be mandated." Harper closed his eyes briefly. "Understood." "One more thing," the voice added. Your aircraft's certification remains intact. For now. The line went dead. Harper exhaled long and slow, then keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for your patience. We have clearance to depart." A collective release swept the cabin. Not applause, not relief. Something quieter. Gratitude mixed with exhaustion. As the engines finally began to spool up, a low rising hum filling the cabin, Elijah closed the tablet and secured it in his bag. He felt the familiar vibration beneath his feet, the shift from stillness to motion. The plane began to move, inching forward, guided by lights and lines painted into concrete. The older man across the aisle leaned back, eyes closed now, as if savoring the moment. "Never thought I'd be grateful for a delay," he murmured. Elijah looked out the window as the runway lights aligned ahead of them, a long, glowing path into darkness. Margaret Whitmore sat alone in a small, windowless office somewhere behind them, answering questions she had never expected to face, realizing too late that the world she understood had rules she had ignored. The aircraft accelerated. Pressure pressed Elijah into his seat as the wheels left the ground. The city fell away beneath them, a web of light and shadow receding into distance. In the cabin, conversations faded. Seatbelt signs glowed. The plane climbed smooth and steady toward thinner air. Elijah rested his head back for just a moment, eyes closed, listening to the sound of flight reclaiming its rhythm. This was never about a seat. It was about whether systems held when tested. Tonight they had. And somewhere above the clouds, the future adjusted its course, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, one correction at a time. The cabin settled into the peculiar stillness that only arrives after a crisis has passed, but before sleep claims its territory. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Tray tables stayed upright. Voices dropped to whispers as if the plane itself had earned a kind of reverence. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, black and unknowable, a vastness that made human disputes feel small and yet strangely important. Elijah opened his eyes and checked the cabin around him. People were different now. Not grateful, not angry, thoughtful. The older man across the aisle had folded his hands over his stomach and stared at the ceiling, lips moving slightly as if replaying a memory. 2 rows back, a woman pressed her forehead to the window, eyes glassy, watching clouds slide past like slow ghosts. Emily walked the aisle quietly, movements precise, almost ceremonial. She stopped beside Elijah's seat, hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Sir," she said softly. Her voice was steadier than before, but careful. "Can I get at you anything?" Elijah looked up at her. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the strain behind the professionalism. He shook his head. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." She nodded, but didn't move right away. "I wanted to say earlier. I'm sorry." Elijah considered her for a moment. "I know," he said. "You were trying to keep things from getting worse." Emily swallowed. "I thought I was protecting the flight. You were protecting the moment," Elijah replied. "That's different." Her eyes flickered, understanding settling in slowly. She straightened and continued down the aisle, shoulders squared now, as if carrying something heavier, but more honest. Across the aisle, the older man cleared his throat. "Mind if I ask you something?" Elijah turned toward him. "Go ahead." "What you did back there," the man said, choosing his words. "Most people wouldn't have the nerve, or the patience." Elijah looked out the window again. "Most people don't have a system watching everything they do." The man chuckled quietly. "Fair enough. Still, you didn't humiliate her. You didn't gloat." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. "That wouldn't have helped." The man nodded. "My wife used to say that real power doesn't need witnesses." Elijah smiled faintly at that. The cabin lights dimmed another notch. Night deepened. The engines maintained a steady rhythm, a sound so constant it faded into the background of thought. Elijah reached into his backpack and pulled out his tablet again. The Atlas interface bloomed to life, soft blues and greens, tracing invisible currents of air around the aircraft. The system adjusted subtly, continuously, a quiet guardian correcting paths long before danger announced itself. A message appeared. Caleb Oversight accepted structural explanation. No intent flagged. Training revisions incoming. Elijah read it twice. Relief did not come. Satisfaction didn't either. Only resolve. He typed back. "Good. Then we build it better." He set the tablet aside and leaned back, closing his eyes. The memory of Margaret Whitmore's face surfaced uninvited. The certainty she had worn like armor. The moment it cracked, he felt no triumph in it, only a dull ache, the kind that came when a flaw revealed itself in a system you had trusted to be better. In a small office back at the airport, Margaret sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on a blank wall. The questions had stopped, but the silence was worse. Each pause allowed the truth to sink deeper. No assistant would smooth this over. No call would undo it. She had mistaken habit for entitlement, comfort for correctness, and for the first time in decades the world had not bent. Back in the sky, Captain Harper emerged from the cockpit, moving quietly down the aisle. He stopped beside Elijah's seat. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" he asked. Elijah nodded and shifted slightly. Harper lowered himself into the empty seat beside him, the weight of responsibility still visible in the set of his shoulders. He looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "I've been flying a long time," Harper said. "I've seen systems fail in storms, in mechanical faults, in human error. What happened tonight that was new?" Elijah waited. "I keep thinking about the moment the purser chose the easy route," Harper continued. "I've probably done the same thing a dozen times without realizing it." "Most people have," Elijah said. "That's why the system watches for it." Harper turned to him. "You designed Atlas to catch us. I designed it to protect the people we can't see." Elijah replied. "The ones who trust that the rules apply equally." Harper nodded slowly. "You're young." Elijah smiled slightly. "I hear that a lot." And yet Harper went on. "You carry yourself like someone who's already seen the cost of mistakes." Elijah's expression softened. "My mother worked maintenance scheduling, night shifts, double shifts. She used to say that accidents never come from one big failure. They come from 1,000 small allowances." Harper absorbed that. She was right. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. When Harper stood to leave, he hesitated. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you were on this flight." Elijah met his gaze. "So am I." The captain returned to the cockpit. Hours passed. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams bled into the low hum of engines and the faint glow of cabin lights. When Elijah woke, the world outside the window had changed. Dawn edged the horizon, a thin line of silver breaking the darkness clouds painted in pale gold. The cabin stirred. People stretched. Voices returned softer now, more human. Coffee cups clinked. The smell of warmth and familiarity spread. Emily passed by again this time, with confidence in her step. She caught Elijah's eye and offered a small, genuine smile. He returned it. The older man across the aisle leaned over once more. "You know, he said, I spent 40 years thinking the world only changes when someone shouts." Elijah glanced at him. "Turns out," the man continued, "sometimes it changes when someone refuses to move." Elijah considered that as the plane began its descent, the engines adjusting pitched the ground, slowly rising to meet them. As they touched down, smooth and controlled, a quiet applause rippled through the cabin. Not for the landing, for everything else. Elijah gathered his bag and stood when the seatbelt sign went dark. He waited his turn. No rushing, no special treatment. As he stepped into the aisle, he felt lighter than he had when he boarded. Not because he had won something, because something had shifted. This flight would be written into reports, training modules, quiet conversations in boardrooms and briefing rooms, not as a scandal, as a correction. And Elijah walked forward, knowing that somewhere in systems unseen, the margins had tightened just enough to keep someone else safe. That was enough. The jet rolled to the gate in London under a pale grey sky rain streaking the windows like thin lines drawn by an unsteady hand. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin exhaled again, this time with relief that felt earned. People rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs, gathering coats and bags. No one rushed. Whatever urgency they had boarded with had been burned away somewhere over the Atlantic. Elijah stood when it was his turn. He slid his backpack over one shoulder, fingers brushing the worn strap out of habit. The door ahead opened, letting in the cool, damp air of Heathrow, and with it a quiet sense of finality. Captain Harper stood near the cockpit, watching passengers disembark. When Elijah reached him, the captain inclined his head, a gesture small but unmistakable. "Safe travels," Harper said. Elijah nodded. "You too, Captain." They shared a look that held more than words. Then Elijah stepped onto the jet bridge, the sounds of the airport swelling around him. Rolling suitcases, distant announcements, footsteps echoing against metal and concrete. He moved with the crowd at first anonymous, again just another traveler. That anonymity lasted exactly 12 steps. Elijah Brooks. The voice was calm, male American, official without being hostile. Elijah stopped and turned. A man in a dark suit stood a few feet away, credentials clipped to his jacket. Late 50s, close-cropped grey hair, eyes sharp but not unkind. "My name is Thomas Keller," the man said. "Federal Aviation Administration. I was hoping we could talk." Elijah glanced past him at the flow of passengers, continuing forward, then back again. "Here." Keller nodded. Briefly. They stepped aside away from the stream of people. The jet bridge felt suddenly narrow, the ceiling lower. "I'll be direct," Keller said. "Last night triggered a cascade, not just for the airline. For us." Elijah waited. "We've been piloting oversight algorithms for years," Keller continued. "None of them have ever initiated a hold like that. Clean, targeted, defensible." Elijah met his gaze. That was the goal. Keller studied him for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "You understand what you did?" "I understand what the system did," Elijah replied. "That distinction matters," Keller said. "And it's going to be debated." Elijah shrugged slightly. "It always is." Keller exhaled. "There will be hearings, not public. Yet. There will be pressure to soften what happened, to frame it as an anomaly." "And will you?" Elijah asked. "Let them." Keller's expression hardened. "No." A pause. "Good," Elijah said. Keller reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. "I'd like you to call me when you have time. Not as Atlas. As you." Elijah took the card, slipped it into his pocket. "I will." They parted without ceremony. Beyond the terminal, London waited. Wet pavement, black cabs. The hum of a city waking up. Elijah stepped outside and paused, letting the drizzle settle against his face. He pulled his hood up, more out of habit than need, and headed toward the curb. A black sedan idled nearby, engine running. The rear door opened before he reached it. Caleb stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "You look like hell," Caleb said. Elijah smiled faintly. "You should see the logs." They clasped hands briefly. A quick, familiar gesture, then Caleb ushered him into the car. The door closed, muting the world outside. The car pulled away from the terminal, merging into traffic. "Phones have been lighting up since dawn," Caleb said. "Airlines, regulators, a couple of senators pretending this isn't political." Elijah leaned back, eyes closing for a moment. "And the airline," Caleb snorted. "They're in damage control mode. But Harper backed us. Hard." "That matters," Elijah said. "It does." Caleb agreed. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city sliding past in blurred reflections. Elijah watched raindrops race down the window, merging and separating in patterns that reminded him of data streams. "You okay?" Caleb asked finally. Elijah opened his eyes. "Ask me again in a week." Caleb nodded understanding. They arrived at a modest hotel near the river. No luxury, no spectacle. Just clean lines and quiet efficiency. Elijah checked in under his own name. No one looked twice. In the room, he set his bag down and stood by the window, watching the Thames move slowly below, indifferent to everything above it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. "Elijah Brooks," a voice said. "Female. Controlled. British. This is Director Anne Whitfield with the Civil Aviation Authority. We need to speak." Elijah closed his eyes briefly. "Of course. We're convening an emergency technical review this afternoon." Whitfield continued. "Your system forced our hand. I imagine that was intentional." "It was necessary," Elijah replied. A pause. Then I.C. Whitfield said, "You'll be there?" "Yes." The call ended. Elijah let the phone drop to his side. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the rain, feeling the weight settle back onto his shoulders. This was the part no one filmed. No cabins, no confrontations. Just rooms and conversations and choices that would echo quietly for years. Back in New York, in a quiet house, overlooking a manicured lawn, Margaret Whitmore sat alone at her kitchen table. Morning light spilled across polished wood and untouched china. Her phone lay face down beside her. It had not stopped ringing since dawn. She did not answer it. The headlines were already forming, though none had her name yet. Compliance review, passenger incident, airline procedure under scrutiny. She stared at her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone and saw something she did not recognize. Not anger, not outrage, fear, not of exposure, of irrelevance. She rose slowly and moved to the window, watching a neighbor load groceries into a car. The ordinariness of it all suddenly jarring. In London, Elijah buttoned his jacket and left the hotel, stepping back into the rain. Each step carried him farther from the boy on the plane and closer to the man the world would soon have to contend with. He did not relish it. He accepted it. Because systems did not change themselves, and if last night had proven anything, it was that silence, when paired with resolve, could still move the ground beneath the most powerful institutions in the world. The city swallowed him as he walked, another figure among millions, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that something fundamental had shifted and that the work was only beginning. The conference room overlooked the Thames, all glass and steel and quiet authority, the kind of place where voices lowered themselves automatically and decisions outlived the people who made them. Elijah sat at the far end of the table, jacket folded neatly beside him, hands resting flat palms down. He had not opened his tablet yet. He was listening to the room breathe. Director Whitfield entered without ceremony. Early 60s, silver hair pulled back tight, eyes that missed nothing. 2 advisors followed, then a legal counsel with a leather folio worn smooth at the corners. "Mr. Gore," Brooks Whitfield said, taking her seat. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Thank you for calling," Elijah replied. She studied him for a beat longer than necessary. Not assessing competence, assessing posture. He met her gaze without challenge. "We'll be direct," Whitfield said. "Your system initiated a compliance hold on an international carrier operating under joint jurisdiction. That is unprecedented." Elijah nodded once. So was the situation. A murmur moved around the table. Not disagreement. Interest. Whitfield steepled her fingers. "You understand the concern. An automated system influencing operational authorities always is questions about accountability." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "Not aggressive. Engaged. The system didn't replace authority," he said. "It exposed a lapse in it." "Semantics," one of the advisors said quietly. "Definitions." Elijah replied just as quietly. "They matter when lives depend on them." Silence. The river slid past the windows, grey and patient. Whitfield gestured. "Show us." Elijah powered on the tablet. The Atlas interface filled the air between them, projected onto the glass wall. Layers unfolded. Decision trees, timelines, human inputs overlaid against protocol requirements. "This is the moment the deviation occurred," Elijah said, indicating a branching node. "A request was made to the wrong party to resolve a conflict caused by non-compliance. The system flagged it as a pressure-induced error and chose to intervene," Whitfield said. "And chose to pause," Elijah corrected. "Intervention would have meant override. Atlas does not override pilots or regulators. It pauses movement when margin erodes." The legal counsel leaned forward. "By grounding the flight. By requesting verification," Elijah said. "Grounding was the outcome of human confirmation." Whitfield watched the data scroll, her expression unreadable. "You built this to watch people. I built it to watch patterns," Elijah replied. "People create them." One of the advisors cleared his throat. "This could have commercial implications. Airlines may resist a system that exposes internal culture failures." Elijah didn't look away from the display. "Then they should fix the culture." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Whitfield raised a hand, cutting it off. "What you're proposing," she said, "is not just a safety tool. It's an ethical one." Elijah turned to face her fully. "Safety without ethics is an illusion." The room went still. Whitfield leaned back slowly. "You're asking regulators to accept a system that forces uncomfortable truths. I'm asking you to accept reality before reality forces you," Elijah said. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, Whitfield nodded. "We'll authorize an expanded pilot, joint oversight, transparent review." Relief flickered across a few faces. Not Elijah's. "There's a condition," Whitfield added. Elijah waited. "You will testify," she said. "When the time comes." Elijah met her gaze. "I will." The meeting adjourned without handshakes. Outside, the rain had stopped. London breathed grey and alive. Elijah walked along the river collar, up thoughts moving faster than his steps. His phone buzzed. "Caleb." "You're trending." Quietly. "That's worse." Elijah typed back. "Good." He stopped near the bridge, watching a boat cut through the water wake, spreading outward in widening arcs. That was how change moved. Not explosions. Ripples. Back in New York, Margaret Whitmore sat across from her attorney, hands folded, posture rigid. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. "They're recommending a settlement," the attorney said, gently. "Non-admission. Confidential." Margaret stared at the wall behind him. "They're treating me like a liability." The attorney hesitated. "They're treating the incident that way." She laughed once sharp, humorless. "There is no difference." Silence settled. She felt it then fully. The shift. The loss of gravity. Doors that would open slower now. Invitations that would not come. "Do it," she said finally. The attorney nodded. In the air above the Atlantic, another flight adjusted course, slightly invisible to the passengers on board. A correction so small it would never be noticed. A margin reclaimed. In London, Elijah entered a small cafe near the river and ordered black coffee. He sat by the window watching people pass, ordinary lives, unaware of systems moving beneath them. A man at the next table leaned over. "Excuse me," he said. "Were you on that flight last night?" Elijah glanced up. "Yes." The man nodded slowly. "My daughter's a flight attendant, new. She called me this morning, said something changed." Elijah held his cup, warmth seeping into his hands. "I hope it did." The man smiled, eyes softening. "Me too." Elijah finished his coffee and stood, leaving exact change on the table. As he stepped back onto the street, his phone buzzed again. "Keller. We're moving faster than expected. Brace yourself." Elijah slipped the phone into his pocket and walked on. He thought of his mother, of nights waiting for her to come home from scheduling rooms filled with fluorescent light and tired voices, of the belief she had held on to that if systems were fair, people could be too. He did not know if that was true, but he knew this. The ground had shifted, not enough to topple anything yet, but enough that those standing on old assumptions would feel it under their feet. And when they did, they would have a choice: adapt or fall. The first headline did not use his name. It never did at the beginning. Instead, it spoke in abstractions: automated oversight, compliance disruption, international carrier delay under review, language carefully sanded down, edges removed, responsibility blurred into fog. Elijah read it on his phone while standing in line for coffee near Canary Wharf, the morning crowd pressing in around him, suits and umbrellas, and half-heard conversations moving with mechanical precision. He scrolled once, then again. By the third article, the tone had shifted. Unnamed source, internal review, cultural lapse. He locked the screen and stepped forward as the barista called his order. The cup was warm in his hand, grounding, real. Behind him, two men argued quietly about market-open volatility. A woman laughed too loudly into her headset. The city continued, unaware that something subtle had begun to tilt beneath its feet. His phone buzzed again. Caleb Airline Legal just triggered arbitration clauses. They're not backing out, but they're circling. Elijah typed back. Let them. He stepped outside the river, reflecting steel-grey sky, and walked without destination, letting his thoughts stretch. He had expected resistance. What unsettled him was the speed. Institutions did not move quickly unless threatened. Across the ocean, in a glass-walled conference room in New York, a group of executives stared at a projection of Atlas metrics they barely understood. Red lines traced hypothetical failures. Green margins pulsed calmly where systems held. A man at the head of the table cleared his throat. We are not putting a machine between us and our customers. A woman to his left didn't look up from her notes. We already have. We just didn't give it a name. Silence followed. Then murmurs. Calculations. Someone else spoke. If we don't adopt it, regulators may mandate it. That landed harder. Back in London, Elijah entered a small office building with no signage and rode the elevator alone to the 5th floor. The doors opened onto a quiet space filled with whiteboards, monitors, and the low hum of servers. This was where Atlas had been born, not in grandeur, in persistence. He set his bag down and powered up the central console. Data bloomed across the wall. Overnight activity, global routes, minor adjustments cascading outward. One anomaly pulsed gently. He zoomed in. A domestic flight in the Midwest. Minor crew deviation corrected early. No hold. No drama. This was the point. His phone rang. Not buzzed. Rang. Unknown number. He answered. Elijah Brooks, a voice said. Male measured American. This is Senator Markham. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Good morning, Senator. I'll get right to it, Markham said. You've put us in an interesting position. I didn't realize safety was controversial, Elijah replied. A pause, then a chuckle, dry. You're young. I'm thorough, Elijah said. Markham exhaled. There's concern that your system removes human discretion. Elijah leaned against the desk, eyes on the data. It measures it. That's a fine line. It's a necessary one. Another pause. We're convening a closed-door briefing. You'll be invited. Elijah nodded, though the man couldn't see it. I'll attend. Good, Markham said. Because this is bigger than one flight now. I know, Elijah replied. The call ended. Elijah stood still for a moment, letting the weight settle. Bigger. That word again. It always arrived just before the work multiplied. Back in New York, Margaret Whitmore watched the news in silence as analysts debated airline accountability. Her name was not mentioned. Yet. She felt it hovering, waiting for the right angle. Her attorney had advised discretion. Silence. Time. But time felt different now. Not a cushion. A spotlight waiting to turn. She muted the television and stared at the reflection in the dark screen. For the first time in her life, she wondered what would have happened if she had simply moved seats. The question lingered heavy and useless. In London, Caleb entered the office, rain dampening his coat. He took one look at Elijah's face and knew. Calls, Caleb asked, Senator Elijah said, and probably more coming. Caleb nodded. We're being painted as idealists with a God complex. Elijah allowed himself a thin smile. That's progress. Caleb laughed once, then sobered. You okay with this going public? Elijah looked at the data wall, at the quiet corrections unfolding in real time. It already is. Caleb studied him. You didn't do this for recognition. No, Elijah said. I did it because waiting would have cost someone else. Caleb nodded slowly. Then we hold. That evening, the first opinion piece dropped. The headline sharper now. Algorithmic morality. Who decides when machines decide? Elijah read it without emotion. He had anticipated the argument, the fear beneath it. People did not fear machines. They feared losing the ability to excuse themselves. He closed the article and opened another. This one quieter. A retired pilot writing about margins and memory. About accidents that began with small allowances. Elijah read that one twice. His phone buzzed. Emily, I don't know if I should text you, but I wanted to say thank you. They told us today they're changing training, really changing it. Elijah stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. That matters. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, a constellation built by hands and systems and habits. This was the part that never made stories. The waiting, the pressure, the quiet recalibration of power. In a boardroom across town, a vote was taken. Narrow, contentious, necessary. In Washington, staffers drafted language that would shape policy without ever mentioning his name. In the sky, planes flew on unaware, safer by margins too small to feel. Elijah stood and walked to the window, looking out over the river. He thought of his mother again, of the way she used to sit at the kitchen table late at night, schedules spread before her, pencil tapping as she searched for patterns. You fix the system, she had said once, and you don't have to fix the people every day. He had not known then how heavy that responsibility would feel. The phone buzzed again. Keller. It's starting. Don't flinch. Elijah slipped the phone into his pocket and stood there, watching the water move, steady and unbothered. He would not flinch, because the ground had already moved, and now everyone else would have to learn how to stand on it. The hearing room was smaller than Elijah had expected. No grand chamber, no cameras, just a long oak table, muted lights, and a silence that felt engineered to expose every weakness in the people who entered it. This was not a place for speeches. It was a place for consequences. Elijah took his seat at the far end, jacket-buttoned posture, relaxed but alert. Across from him sat a semicircle of officials, regulators, legal counsel, policy architects, people who rarely agreed on anything except the need to protect their own margins. At the center sat Senator Markham, hands folded, eyes sharp. "We're here to understand impact," Markham said. "Not intent." Impact. Elijah nodded. "Then we're in the right room." A woman to Markham's left leaned forward. "Your system halted a commercial aircraft without a direct human command. It paused movement pending verification," Elijah replied. "That distinction is the difference between chaos and control." A man farther down the table interjected. "You're comfortable letting software trigger federal scrutiny. I'm not comfortable letting humans bypass standards when pressure rises," Elijah said calmly. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Not outrage, recognition. Markham steepled his fingers. "Let's talk about precedent." Elijah leaned back slightly. "Precedent is written after failure," he said. This was prevention. Silence followed, the kind that tested resolve. Another official spoke. "What happens when your system is wrong?" Elijah met her gaze. "Then it stops," he said, "and humans review it. The same way they do every other safeguard." "That's not reassuring," she replied. "It's honest," Elijah said. Markham exhaled. "You forced us to consider a future where discretion is monitored." Elijah nodded. "Discretion is where risk hides." The hearing stretched on. Questions layered over questions. Hypotheticals sharpened into scenarios. Elijah answered each one without flourish, without defense. He did not argue philosophy. He described structure, data, margins, probabilities. Eventually, Markham leaned back. "We're going to move forward with conditional authorization," he said. "Expanded oversight, sunset clauses, human review." Elijah inclined his head. That's acceptable. Markham studied him. You don't seem relieved. Elijah paused. Relief implies the work is done. A faint smile tugged at Markham's mouth. Fair enough. The meeting ended without ceremony. Outside, Elijah stood alone in the hallway for a moment, letting the weight lift just enough to breathe. The building hummed quietly, the sound of systems functioning as designed. His phone buzzed. Caleb authorization confirmed. Conditional, but real. Elijah typed back. Then we deliver. Across the ocean, in a quiet living room, Margaret Whitmore watched the afternoon light shift across her walls. The house was too quiet now. The absence of calls had replaced the chaos with something colder. Her phone chimed. A message from her attorney. Settlement finalized. Confidentiality upheld. Advisory board resignation accepted. She stared at the screen, then set the phone down gently, as if it might break. For years, she had believed the world responded to certainty. Tonight she understood it responded to alignment, and she had been out of it. She stood and walked to the bookshelf, fingers tracing spines she had collected for display more than comfort. She pulled one down at random. A history of aviation. She opened it, reading without focus, the words blurring. Somewhere deep inside, a question formed. Not why this happened, but how many times she had benefited from the same bending of rules without noticing. The thought unsettled her more than the consequences. Back in London, Elijah returned to the office late, the city dark and reflective under streetlights. Caleb sat at the desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. Exhaustion written plainly across his face. You did it, Caleb said. We started it, Elijah corrected. Caleb smiled faintly. Same difference. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the data wall. Flights traced arcs across the globe. Tiny adjustments pulsed quietly. Do you ever wonder, Caleb asked, if we're pushing too hard? Elijah considered the question. I wonder if we waited too long. Caleb nodded. Elijah's phone buzzed again. Emily. I heard about the hearing. They told us today we're getting scenario-based training. Real ones, not scripts, Elijah typed back. Good. He set the phone down and leaned back, eyes closing briefly. Fatigue washed over him, heavy and insistent. This was the part no one warned you about. The moment after momentum when the body demanded its due. When he opened his eyes, Caleb was watching him. Get some rest, Caleb said. Tomorrow's going to be worse. Elijah smiled faintly. I know. He left the office and walked into the night, letting the cool air clear his head. The river moved steadily beside him, indifferent and constant. He thought again of his mother, of the way she used to say that systems didn't fail all at once. They eroded, quietly, until one day there was nothing left to hold. Tonight, something had been reinforced, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. As he crossed the bridge, his phone buzzed one last time. Keller FAA draft language includes mandatory monitoring. You're in it. Elijah stopped at the center of the bridge and looked out over the water lights, shimmering like fractured stars. He typed back. Then let's make it count. He slipped the phone into his pocket and kept walking, knowing that the story would soon be told by others in headlines and hearings and quiet policy shifts. But the truth would remain simpler. A system had been tested, and it had held. The world did not change overnight. It never did. There was no single headline that captured what followed, no dramatic announcement that declared a new era. Instead, change arrived the way it always does, when it matters most, quietly, systematically, without asking permission. 3 weeks after the flight, Elijah stood in a narrow hallway outside a training center in Ohio, watching a group of flight attendants file into a simulator room. They were older than Emily, on average. Some with decades in the air. Some with creases in their uniforms that told stories no one ever wrote down. Their voices were calm, practiced, but their eyes were alert. On the wall beside the door hung a simple placard. Updated compliance scenario training. No names, no explanation. Inside, a recorded voice began to play, guiding them through a situation that felt uncomfortably familiar. A seating dispute, a time pressure, a choice between speed and principle. Elijah did not go in. He never did. He watched from the hallway, hands in his pockets, listening through the glass as pauses stretched longer than they used to, as voices questioned assumptions that once went unchallenged. That was how he knew it was working. Across the country in Washington, draft language hardened into policy. Words like recommendation quietly became requirement. Monitoring became standard. Discretion gained a second set of eyes. No speeches were given. No victory laps taken. The system did not punish. It remembered. At Atlas headquarters, the data wall glowed steadily. Fewer holds now, fewer flags. Not because the system had softened, but because behavior had adjusted. Margins widened. Small corrections happened earlier, before escalation, before harm. Caleb leaned against the console one evening, coffee in hand, watching the streams settle into new rhythms. "They're learning," he said. "They always were," Elijah replied. "They just needed a mirror." In New York, Margaret Whitmore sold her house, quietly. No announcement, no farewell party. She moved into a smaller place near her sister, the kind of home that required fewer assumptions. The days were slower now, quieter. She read more than she spoke. When she flew again, months later, she boarded last, sat where she was assigned, and kept her eyes on the window the entire time. No one recognized her, and for the first time she wondered if that was what equality had always felt like. Emily was promoted at the end of the quarter, not because of the incident, but because of how she responded to it. She trained new hires now. When she spoke about protocol, she did not recite scripts. She told stories, real ones, about pressure, about sadness, about the moment when a choice seems small and ends up mattering more than anything else. Her trainees listened. Captain Harper retired 6 months later on his own terms. At his final flight briefing, he spoke briefly without notes. He thanked his crew. He reminded them that authority was not about volume, but clarity, that the safest flights were not the smoothest, but the most honest. He did not mention Elijah by name. He did not need to. Elijah himself faded from public conversation almost as quickly as he had entered it. His name appeared in footnotes, in regulatory filings, in acknowledgments that most people never read. He preferred it that way. Power was most effective when it did not announce itself. On a quiet evening, he sat alone at his kitchen table. Laptop, closed city lights blinking outside the window. He thought of his mother again, of her pencil tapping against paper, of her belief that systems could be made fair if someone cared enough to try. He had cared. The world had resisted, and then slowly it had adjusted. Not because a teenager demanded it, not because a system forced it, but because enough people at enough moments chose to stop bending rules for comfort and start standing still long enough to let the truth surface. That was the real story. Not a stolen seat, not a grounded flight, but the quiet refusal to move when moving would have meant becoming smaller. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments by writing these 3 words. Stand for dignity. Stand.